while we listen to Patrick Bond. Patrick, I've just lost my notes on you. Yeah, so you've moved around the world and a distinguished professor at the University of Johannesburg, among other things. So if you'd just like to say perhaps a few more words about yourself and what you'll be talking about. This session is kind of focusing on peace and climate in the future of the world order. We had a bit of an intro there from Peter talking about the unipolar and multipolar world.
Everything is fine on my side, but can you see my slide?
We can.
Okay, well, it is obviously a day where we celebrate South Africa. I've just come from a march in central Berlin, and I saw Palestinian flags and South African flags. Very rare for us to have such pride, national pride. But I would like to indicate a couple of problems or ideas about ways forward for solidarity with Palestine based on our history. Of course, our history is so bound up with Olof Palme and the Swedish activists who gave us strong solidarity to get rid of apartheid. And you were rewarded in 1986 with what at least Stig Larsson and many others would say was a South African assassin of your prime minister. Let me come back to the Israeli genocide claims in the International Court of Justice the last couple of days. But I also want to raise something that my dear friend Peter has provoked, the question of BRICS and whether especially anti-imperialist potential exists. I want to argue there is more sub-imperialism, and the Conference of Polluters 28 in Dubai with the new BRICS member hosting the United Arab Emirates is my clearest case. Well, I could talk about FIFA and how in 2010, South Africa 2014, Brazil 2018, Russia, that's another kind of imperialism and sub-imperialism. But we get this critique from Brazilians and from Samir Amin. So it may be useful to just review why our climate critique of the BRICS and of South Africa is also bound up in a concern that I love talking to Swedes about with the failure of imperialist multilateralism in the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the UN Security Council. We may not have time, but there are so many disappointments from the BRICS, Peter. The vaccine center we were promised in 2018 that never occurred. Indeed, we had hoped for unity in the WTO against the intellectual property tyranny on the COVID-19 vaccines and medicines. We'd hoped for an internet cable for the BRICS because the United States is always spying through the National Security Agency. We'd hoped for financial reforms. Here, Peter, we have to have a good discussion about the strength of BRICS support for the IMF, its recapitalization in 2015 with no conditions, and the continuation of the European leadership of the IMF supported by the BRICS, even in cases, well, must I say the name, Rodrigo Rato, or the recent IMF director, Christine Lagarde, who was convicted for corruption by Adidas when she was the French finance minister, but was continued. Plenty of other crises in IMF leadership, or the failure to get us a new credit rating agency. In fact, so much so that the BRICS Bank has supported the Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch downgrading of Russia and won't lend to Russia. Now, I don't support lending to Russia. I think Putin's invasion was a sub-imperial invasion. But we were most disappointed in August with the failure to develop de-dollarization strategies, a currency alternative, which was so hyped within the BRICS support base. Now, I'm very happy to be with you, and especially because you probably saw on Thursday such a strong statement of why the experience of fighting apartheid allowed our legal experts like Thembeke Ntluga-Tobe to make such strong cases. And we were supported not by Sweden, but by civilized countries, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, a few others that we can go into. But the point being, it's time for activists in Sweden to make sure what happens in the coming weeks. In the short term, the need for an injunction to get a ceasefire. But I think, as Eleanor said, if we leave our faith in the justices of the International Court of Justice, the leader, Joan Donoghue, from the State Department, known in the 1980s for defending the US when they were bombing or mining the harbor of Nicaragua, or turning down the Chagos Island appeal to get the UK to decolonize and the US to move its base out. So Joan Donoghue, the president of the ICJ, coming from the US State Department, but also South Africa's judge, whose name is Dikgang Moseneke, who was put in, comes from a sub-imperialist corporate neoliberal background. So there are contradictions. We have no problem, do we, in thinking dialectically, Tembeka Nhlokatobi being the most eloquent of our advocates who can fight for justice, or Adila Hassim, you also saw leading some of the evidence on Thursday, who was and is one of the great critics of the South African state on its neoliberal social policy, austerity that led to 144 mentally ill people being killed, basically, by the definancing of life as Sedimini. We could go on about these dialectics where we are always seeking to understand even the government's team representing the South African people, all of the allies, and above all, the victims of genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, are also extremely powerful critics of the South African government at home. And this is the spirit I hope to bring to you by just mentioning, this is only a teaser for you, the critiques from the BRICS from Below network, because when we got to COP28, we'll see, like the other COPs, especially Copenhagen 2009, the role of the BRICS Plus in amplifying imperialism in climate policy, not providing an alternative, violations of sovereignty, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Saudi Arabian attacks, UAE attacks on Yemen. My favorite chant today, Yemen, Yemen, we are proud, turn another ship around. Worsening inequality, poverty, pandemic mismanagement, looting of Africa's resources, climate change and ecocide, violence against women, abuse of high-tech, censorship, surveillance, austerity, neoliberalism, false de-dollarization, human rights abuses. These are the sorts of critiques, especially of BRICS tyrannies, the BRICS Plus countries having now Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia. These are tyrannies that have just joined existing tyrannies like Russia, China, India. Now, in Brazil and South Africa, we would be a little bit more measured since these are democratic countries, but with profound injustices that are sustained. There are going to be all sorts of new members chosen in Russia when the BRICS Plus meet in Kazan in October. And they will be oil addicted and tyrannical, and they will have major contributions to global GDP, to global population, really to the extent to which oil is being produced and emissions are being created, and hence a tendency by the BRICS not to be fighting the West as we had, all of us, I'm sure, hoped, Peter, articulating it. There must be an alternative to the West, and it must be the BRICS, Latoufe, the great Brazilian cartoonist. But the reality is, as Sam Moyo and Paris Yaris have put it, a BRICS sub-imperialism, some of which are driven by private blocks of capital, like in Brazil and India, some driven by state-owned enterprises in China. In South Africa, an extreme degree of denationalization of the economy, in short, white capital fleeing mainly to London, an unpatriotic bourgeoisie. And crucially, the degree of participation in the Western military project is also different from one case to the next, although one might say there's a schizophrenia to all of this, typical of sub-imperialism. We see that certainly with South Africa's opposition to the US here, and also in relation, in terms of Israel, and also in relation to the support de facto that South Africa gives Russia. But these are schizophrenic relationships because mostly, especially when you look at the Quad, where Narendra Modi is so clearly anti-Chinese in this major bloc, right? And the China Daily is pretty open about how disturbed Beijing is about this, the leadership of the Quad. But we see this most explicitly, the sub-imperial relationship of BRICS Plus to imperialism in climate, because the UAE hosting in Dubai, the COP28 last month, put in charge the man, I'm sure all of you know this, I don't need to repeat this, the critique, but it's Sultan Al Jaber and the United Arab Emirates main oil company, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, that he headed during this process and allowed all sorts of, let's say, very dubious and unethical deals to go down. This is not new. If you look at this Copenhagen famous photograph in 2009, the US plus Brazil, South Africa, India, China, Barack Obama barged into the room. As Edward Snowden showed us, this was because the NSA had such good tracking devices, they found exactly where the other leaders of the basic Brazil, South Africa, India, China, that is Wen Jiabao from China, Lula from Brazil, Manmohan Singh from India, and Jacob Zuma from South Africa were meeting. Now, what you see in this meeting is an alliance, and they have two essential projects. Number one, they don't really want to cut their emissions, their fossil fuels, because their industries and some of their most profitable businesses in oil and gas and coal depend upon never really making the cuts required to stop planetary arson. This is essentially a block of high emissions countries. And it's not just in the current moment, historically, these countries, and we'll add Russia, of course, and South Africa, smaller, but per person, third highest in the world, emitters per person per unit of GDP. And you put these together, and not only do they not want to cut emissions, the second objective is to never acknowledge their climate debts, the reparations, the so-called polluter pays requirements that they would have. And there are plenty of people who try to go through this to think about whether change is possible, like people you'd normally expect to promote the BRICS as alternatives, like Vijay Prashad from the Tricontinental in New Delhi. And he's certainly one of the most eloquent thinkers in the world. But as you get into the devils and the details, here I again speak to my dear friend Peter, you find that these systems that were meant to be alternatives to imperialism end up being nothing much at all. Right of center governments, as far as economic policy, none of them has the appetite to drive an agenda against US dominance over trade institutions, over development institutions. Even the most eloquent and vociferous critic of US imperialism, a Brazilian journalist, Pepe Escobar, has acknowledged what happened in Johannesburg in August was a terrible disappointment when it came to the potential for a basket of currencies for an alternative payment system, or a basket of goods and settlement structures, blockchain, a new pricing system, setting up a single stock exchange, because it would take 30 to 40 years to change that process, and particularly de-dollarization as a sort of politics failed because of India's position. I would add South Africa and Brazil, which have very West-leaning reserve banks and finance ministries, and India refuses to use the yuan, and the imbalance between Russia and India is critical. Now, these are just little points, and I have many, many slides. I'll just finish with this last one, because I think our greatest African political economist, Samir Amin, put it so well. And we should never be confused as critics from the left of imperialism, that the problem with the BRICS and the offensive that the US, Europe, Japan collective against peoples of the South is the economic leg. Globalized neoliberalism continues. The political leg, you can always count on BRICS rhetoricians to talk left, but while they walk right, as Samir put it, some countries of the South, such as the BRICS, they walk on only one leg. They reject geopolitics of imperialism, but accept economic neoliberalism. And I'll just conclude by reminding that it was a wonderful theorist from Brazil, whose work is now translated into English last year, thanks to Monthly Review, Rui Mauro Marini, who gave us the idea of sub-imperialism, describing Brazil in relation to the US. And I think what COP28 did, and what the next COP29 in Azerbaijan will do. And we may be tested by the COP30 in Belém in Brazil when Lula hosts it. But like what we will see, I'm sure, in November in Rio, when the G20 is hosted by Lula, or in 2025 when Johannesburg is the host site for the G20, we will see imperial and sub-imperial, Western and BRICS alliance on too many of the issues we care about. Our politics, therefore, have to be, even on a day we're so proud of South Africa for putting the case for genocide to the World Court to try to stop the absolute horror in Gaza. But we still must have a long-term perspective if we're interested in peace, climate, and all the other issues, which is to be against imperialism and sub-imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Great. I see Göran Terbon with us now.
Yes.
And we hear you as well. Brilliant. So Göran, you're next up in this session, and I've been told that you're a sociologist and internationally well-known Marxist, and you're back in Sweden now, having been active for many years abroad.
And also visited us in Johannesburg last year. We're still so thankful, Göran. Thanks.
So nice to reunite people here. So Göran, add some extra words to your biography if you feel that is necessary, and then you're welcome to take the floor.
Okay, thank you. I think this is an initiative of the Swedish organization People and Peace. I mean, is a wonderful and absolutely necessary initiative in these times. Unfortunately, what is really needed in these times is a strong peace movement, but unfortunately, I mean, we don't see one anyway. Although the People and Peace and other similar movements are doing a heroic effort. I mean, to do what they can. I'm going to give a kind of summing up picture of the world disorder, or of a world out of order, a world of new issues and new challenges to which there are no clear answers yet. Not to speak of solutions and ordering. There are three main dimensions of this disorder, I think, and they have been touched upon previously. I've noticed here, and so let us bring them together and look at their relations. So the first disruption of the world order after 1990 is that the political economy of neoliberal capitalist globalization has broken up, succeeded by a revival of the old and violent game of imperial geopolitics. Secondly, we have, as we all know, the acute planetary crisis, which is shaking the foundations of fossil fuel modernity, as well as the whole ecosystem of the planet. And thirdly, there is the ancient phenomenon of human inequality, which in this century has ceased to be a fate, whether a fate of God or a fate of nature or a fate of capitalism, and instead has emerged as an evil which can be and should be fought directly. In the 2010s, it dawned upon the US power elite that China was winning the game of competition. Sorry, the game of globalization, signaled by China becoming the world's largest economy measured in purchasing power. Although that is not a real measure of economic weight, but an indicator of economic capacity. As a missionary state, the United States is fond of talking about a rule-based order. But rules are only meant for the others. The US has been very careful staying out of as many international orders as possible, from the International Court to the UN conventions of the right of the child or against discrimination, all kinds. And faced with the Chinese market competition, the US changed not only the rules, but the game of the world political economy itself, from globalization to imperial politics, imperial geopolitics. So free trade and free capital flows are no longer rules to compete by. Now, the norm is national security, national interest, tariffs, import and export bans, political investment control, migration walls. And after some brief hesitation, the European Union fell into line, of course, despite being developed as a free trade and free migration project. And at stake is US and Western world domination, as Peter Wahl highlighted earlier. The half a millennium old North Atlantic white Christian dynasty, which has dominated the world since the early 16th century. Imperial geopolitics has always been violent and warring, and we can see the new imperial logic in operation in the ongoing, but in many ways very different wars in the Ukraine and in Gaza. They are both proxy wars, but in which the US and its vassals concentrate on providing the means of killing and the rhetoric of legitimation for their side. And in both cases, the imperial political intervention is focused on prolonging the war until total victory. A draft compromise between the Ukraine and Russia in March-April in 2022 was quashed by the US and the UK. And now the Ukraine and Russia are expected to bleed until regime change in Russia, which in Polish and Baltic dreams would entail a breakup of the Russian Federation into an array of ethnic mini-states. And over Gaza, the US has used its UN veto 3 times so far to allow Israel to continue its destruction of Gaza and its people. The organization Doctors Without Borders had an apt characterization of the American vote on against a ceasefire. It was a vote against humanity. And we are experience a new division of the world around this question of humanity. On the one hand, we have the war-first coalition. The US, its European vassals, the white dominions from Canada to New Zealand, and some Pacific client states from South Korea to Micronesia. And on the other side are the rest of the world, virtually speaking, the peace-first countries, except, of course, for the time being, Milei's Argentina. The rest is very heterogeneous, but is united in one respect at least. They don't buy the US holy war stories and are therefore a force for peace. We should also keep in mind the very progressive role which the UN, its Secretary General, and its specialized organizations, the UNICEF, the WHO, etc., play in standing up for standards of humanity when the US and its European hangers-on are failing them. And as a European, I must say, I mean, it's an eternal shame to see the disgusting insensitivity of the European and the other Western political and media elites for the massacres in Gaza. The world economy is gradually pivoting to Asia. And by 1975, according to the Goldman Sachs Bank, there will be only one Western country among the then G7 of the 7 largest economies in the world. However, I would like to strike a note of caution to left-wing audiences here. The United States is likely to remain a big and formidable power for the foreseeable future, and would rather be one big power among others in the multipolar world. I'm not an expert on climate change and on climate movements, but I think we can now see the contours of the likely unraveling of the fatal climate crisis. There will be an epochal energy transition in an uneven and drawn-out process. The 1.5 centigrade stop is most likely to be missed, and perhaps others as well. The weather extremes will become more frequent and more severe, and the world might reach some catastrophic and irreversible tipping point. But what I would like to underline is that currently the human response process to the crisis is driven by green capitalism and by what might be called greenwashing, for that matter. The worldwide spread of climate crisis awareness is due to the climate movement of committed scientists and dedicated activists. But the movement is not running the response process. Existing state power holders are.
Yeah, and I wonder if you're getting close to the end now.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to wrap up. But what I would like to emphasize is that the stakes are high. The success of green capitalism, at least in terms of power, will consolidate and further reinforce capitalist exploitation and inequality at a global as well as national levels. A blatant failure of green capitalism will open a window of possibility for ecological and egalitarian forces for the left to transform the world. I would stress one thing about the inequality in the world, which is declining between countries and increasing within countries, and which means that class struggles will grow and sharpen in the near future. And concluding, I mean, the stakes of the century. The world is in a disorder of still unresolved conflicts with very high stakes. Will Western domination of the world finally fade by demographic and economic pressure? Or will it be asserted by military power and war? Will the climate crisis issue into a new capitalist era of green capitalism, finance, and artificial intelligence? Will it be the nemesis of capital accumulation and the beginning of a post-capitalist epoch? Or, as a third alternative, will all human responses fail and climate change reaches an irreversible tipping point, sending the whole planet into decline? And will the coming social struggles end up with the victory of the privileged and the cementing of pharaonic inequalities? Or will all human beings, for the first time in history, get access to the possibilities which productivity, science, and culture have created? And it's you, I mean, the younger generation and your movements who will provide the answer to these questions of the century. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. We've got one question in the chat. I've got a bunch of questions as well. The question in the chat was, it's kind of big, so I'm going to leave that until we get a few sort of more basic questions. You both described the movement from this kind of Western-based unipolar towards a multipolar, but it seems almost like we're getting towards a bipolar state of being, with BRICS on one side and the Western hegemony on the other side. Patrick, you described the tyranny of the BRICS lands. And I was just wondering, both of you, perhaps Patrick first, do you think the tyranny will increase as BRICS matures? Or what direction do you see that they're going? Do you think the tyranny will increase as BRICS matures?
Well, thanks, David, and also, of course, to Rosie for putting this incredibly impossible question of our strategy and tactics. And some of them relate to the BRICS, because South Africa was freed partly by struggle from below, but also by interventions from especially Sweden and the as a government, one of the few in the West, and the activists of civil society, who believed, as Samir Amin often pointed out, that the most tyrannical relationships that keep the dictatorships in power, like the apartheid regime, can be addressed through sanctions. So I have put into the chat Omar Barghouti's interview with Owen Jones in the UK and Naomi Klein writing in The Guardian last week about BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. So Rosie, I hope those will give you inspiration. I mean, I also, I talk to Swedes, of course, you have to say, well, multilateral projects that, like Göran was saying, some of them are, genuine. UNICEF and WHO, I'm sure Göran would agree, UNRIS, the UN Research Institute for Social Development. But too much of the multilateral project has been captured by neoliberal corporates. And also, of course, with, you're talking the US, neoliberal, neoconservative fusions, from a neoliberal Clinton to a neoconservative Bush, and a kind of fusion with Obama, and all of the subsequent ways imperialism is played out. Now, my point, David, is that this isn't bipolar. It's imperial, sub-imperial, in a relationship that, with a few rogue exceptions, South Africa went rogue on December 29 by calling genocide. Okay, my comrades in South Africa who fight for Palestinian solidarity say, yeah, that was a good step. So is taking Netanyahu to the International Criminal Court in the way that Putin was, so that we can get an arrest warrant, so he doesn't have freedom of travel. That's also on the agenda. We don't expect much from the ICC, given the power balance. The two problems for South Africans who really want to continue this battle beyond the court hearings, because I think every activist in the House knows what I think Eleanor was saying. You can't put your struggle into the hands of lawyers and judges, especially judges like Joan Donoghue and Dikgang Moseneke and some of the others on that panel. So what are the activists in South Africa demanding? A couple of things. One is breaking diplomatic ties from South Africa to Israel. And the second is tightening BDS. And I think that would come to where we have won, Rosie, we have won two major victories. One was at the height of multilateral legitimacy when even Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl could agree that the UN should do something to ban the chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that were wrecking the ozone, widening the hole. And that was done in the Montreal Protocol of 1987. And by 1996, there were no more CFCs now. HCFC production, especially in China, continued to be a problem. But that particular crisis, thanks to multilateralism, was under control. The more profound answer, Rosie, is, and David, I hope this also speaks to your dilemma, how do we tackle imperial, sub-imperial unity? Because we failed, didn't we, last year, a year and a half ago, in mid-2022, the WHO and the WTO couldn't break through to give us COVID-19 vaccines and treatment as global public goods, in spite of two BRICS countries, South Africa and India, promoting the intellectual property waivers. And it was really Britain and Germany who prevented us from breaking through there. But Rosie, the second of my two examples, in addition to Montreal, was the WTO acknowledged in 2001, after their catastrophe of December 1999 in Seattle, where they needed to renew some legitimacy. They acknowledged that AIDS medicines could be made generically and provided. And in South Africa, with 7 million of our 60 million compatriots living with HIV, to get AIDS medicines at that time was impossible. It cost 10,000 euros a year. Today, 7 million people get those medicines for free, and our life expectancy as a result of a massive struggle by the Treatment Action Campaign, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, ACT UP in the US, all sorts of groups, I'm sure in Sweden too. Our life expectancy in South Africa went from 52 to 65. Just sort of sum up these sorts of lessons, and they're in a recent interview in the Australian journal Links that I put into the chat box. Those are about the ways in which we can combine global and local struggles. They'll be increasingly crucial, but I do want to point to BDS for both the Israeli genocide. We really have to step that up. And secondly, the question of the climate catastrophe. We have to disinvest from fossil fuels. But David, I still would insist, my presentation I've also put there, that bipolar, or let's say multipolar myth-making that some on the left will promote, that the BRICS is some alternative. When you look at the devil in the details, and there are plenty of our examples, I just use UNFCCC and FIFA, but every other site as well that really counts, like the WTO, with the exception of the COVID-19 struggle, which we lost, and the World Bank and the IMF, which we were attempting to reform and failed. Those reflect not an anti-imperial BRICS, but a sub-imperial. They don't work against, but within. Indeed, when you look at what these companies from the BRICS countries, and now we'd add BRICS Plus, what they do on the ground is actually an amplification of some of the worst features of imperialism. And that's why I say that sort of, if I think back to what Swedes did during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to help get rid of apartheid, please find that spirit again when you see people fighting against class apartheid in South Africa, or patriarchy in Iran, or tyranny in China and Russia, or, I mean, I can go on and on. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you. I wonder if you would like to chime in, Göran.
Yes.
The trend of tyranny developing as BRICS matures.
I think we should remember, I mean, what BRICS, the origin of BRIC and the BRICS, I mean, as a designation by a bank economist, so I mean, of fast-growing countries, which then has mutated into something else and so on. And I don't think, I mean, the epithet of sub-imperialism, I mean, is very helpful and useful. The BRICS is not a white knight supporting progressive causes, but it's part of the breaking down of Western domination. and that's a positive thing, I think, and it's there will be other constellations of powers, and it's interesting to notice. I mean, there was, and perhaps still is, a very high attraction to join the BRICS in the global south, and but the organization, I mean, made some very strange choices of the candidates and so on, which I think will, I mean, an obvious candidate would have been Indonesia, which sort of applied for or expressed an interest in it, and there were others. So I think we should see the different kinds of collective initiatives developing, which all of them, in one way or another, will diminish or restrain the power of the US and its vassals.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left, 3 minutes. Might possibly go a little bit over time. Göran, you were talking about that we're missing a strong peace movement at the moment, and Patrick, you were describing how how BRICS doesn't want to step in to fill the void of the trust in Western institutions is failing, and BRICS is not really interested, you said, in stepping in to fill that void. So if civil society is losing the trust in the institutions, so they are failing, and BRICS doesn't want to step in and fill the void. How do you think, and what constitutes a strong peace movement or a strong civil movement that might fill that void? Do you think that, do you think civil society will step in? And how, in that case, do you think that might, how would that look like?
Well, it will have to step in because, I mean,
and you get about 90
seconds. States taking up the mantle. But I think this will be difficult. But and that's a tragedy. But there's one thing which I would like to draw your attention to, and that is the way in which the US and its European vassals have isolated themselves from a large part of the world, for the majority of the world, over the genocide in Gaza. And this characterization of the US veto as a vote against humanity. And this is something, I mean, to remember, and also the contrast. I mean, the UN always has to be neutral and polite and so on, but the contrast between the way in which the United Nations experts and the special organizations working to help humanity have acted, and the stonewalling coldness to all suffering by the US, I think opens up a potential rift in the world, which social movements might and certainly should notice and develop. The rift between the War First coalition and the Coalition for Humanity, which is already established. And I think that's the...
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think we can expect much more from the BRICS than they have done already, but they have indicated, I mean, that other worlds exist, not necessarily very different, but even that is a step forward from the monolithic totalitarian Western rule of the world.
Patrick, you might like to say that it's maybe not a step forward?
Yeah, no, it's fine. Just for my 60 seconds. You're on. Yes, of course, the third world nationalist tradition is always to indicate, but we always watch them if they talk left so they can walk right. That is what we're going to see with the BRICS Plus, getting worse and worse and worse as they bring in tyrannies, oil-addicted countries, patriarchies. You know, we're going to see the BRICS become a huge problem, not any part of any solution. So therefore, if I turn to my guru of civil society, David, to answer your question, connecting to each other and fighting for state power, well, it might be Gösta Esping Anderson. Of course, you're on Third-born, many other Swedes, but Gösta Esping Anderson looked at your case and he found something extraordinary that was generalizable about Scandinavia, which was the communities of the rural and the workers of the urban, a red and green alliance of the period 150 years ago, finding each other, finding parties in alliance after they had founded their institutions, finding class struggles, not class snuggles. In other words, really looking for sites where those contradictions could be brought to the level of the state. I think those formula that are so well known to you as you established at least minimally decent conditions in social democracy, those are ones we keep relearning. And now we do so because we have a much better sense, especially if we're anti-capitalists, that the critique of capitalism isn't just at the point of production, is it? It's at the point of social reproduction and of planetary survival. And it's in those ways that I think we have a much more mature sense in civil society. The dilemma is that so many of our movements feel that their victories are won issue by issue by issue in the silos through an NGOization. I mean, I look at my friend Tord Bjork and find him always reminding us in the climate movement that we mustn't do that, that this, as Naomi Klein says, this changes everything. There are possibilities to critique capitalism more broadly. If we can think about, you know, the profound need to overthrow capitalism, and yeah, Göran is right, the green economy, carbon markets, the EU emissions trading scheme, technological fixes, these just are not going to solve these profound crises. And I think it's there that the anti-capitalist spirit that we feel in your movements in Sweden that can keep coming through, but to do so by linking issues, not by treating them as one by one without any connections. That's the way forward. And it's a great time to be with you. I look forward to learning more from all the comrades in the house.
Well, anyway, I mean, the
Göran, sorry, we must finish now. We're 4 minutes over past, so I've got to pull the plug because, well, for one thing, they're waiting for me with my dinner downstairs. So, since we're all on about the same time space, then I'm sure that's the same for everyone else. A huge thank you to all our speakers tonight and to all our everyone who's joined in the chat. Unfortunately, nobody on Facebook, but that's just the way things go sometimes. Feels like we could have continued a lot longer tonight. But yeah, big thank you to everybody. Some really important threads that we've started pulling at, and we're going to keep pulling at those threads tomorrow and the day after in Swedish. So from 1 o'clock tomorrow, 1 o'clock Central European time, we'll be in Swedish for the next session.